So I do have some questions written down, but you know, we always prefer to get questions from the audience. Could we have an ARC person here? There's a microphone. Does anybody want to volunteer to do microphone passing duty? All right. Do we have any questions from the audience? Yes, sir. If you don't mind just telling us who you are and...
Hello? Yeah, sorry. I'm Merwa Sora with AECOM. Anytime I hear the trusted repository, those type, is basically the traditional model in a way. Has there been any consideration of using blockchain in terms, no, I'm not talking cryptocurrency, blockchain in terms of getting rid of the middleware and just have the trust established between the source and the destination?
All right, we mentioned Stuxnet blockchain. We can check that out.
Yes, as soon as we actually make this a public company, we'll be calling it the Blockchain Security Company. That'll help our share prices. You're absolutely right. I mean, this is something that we're actually working on in the research project. We've struggled to actually get competent blockchain people to help us. They seem to be all over somewhere else, doing something else like printing money. But you're absolutely right. This is an ideal opportunity to use a blockchain technology rather than a traditional server solution. And probably by the time before this research project's finished, I suspect we'll start to try and do a blockchain type of deployment. You're on the money.
While we're passing the mic around, does anybody else want to comment on blockchain? I mean, I haven't heard much on the actual application of blockchain in ICS cybersecurity. I've seen one or two other companies out there, but is this something that...
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, the basic concept of the crypto in blockchain is quite... The basic concept of the crypto in blockchain is very simple. And in fact, at Tofino, we used some blockchain technologies initially, but it wasn't blockchain in the traditional spirit that it was distributed. It was, we owned the whole end of it. But as soon as you do a distributed one, the whole game theory becomes really tricky, and we realized that we weren't smart enough to figure that one out on our own without some serious help. But honestly, I think blockchain has incredible potential for ICS security, for the distribution of information that we want to have that's non-volatile and widely distributed and considered a ledger in a sense. And a possible ledger would be the fingerprints of every piece of known good software. But the trick is how to make sure somebody doesn't poison that.
Yeah, Ira Baxter, Semantic Designs. I wanted to ask why sort of classic digital signatures don't solve this problem. Okay, basically what you've got an encryption based upon on the signer and a way to verify that that's really him. Why doesn't that work?
It does work if you're running a Windows box, but a lot of the boxes out there literally do not support signing. I mean, take PLC5 for example. You can't have that PLC. As far as I can tell, there's no way you can get an old Allen Bradley PLC5 to check any signing whatsoever. You would probably run the poor controller into the ground if you did. So I'm really worried about everything that doesn't support signing right now in its operating system, in its design. How do we pick up all the legacy gear out there? But certainly, new systems that absolutely do have good signing systems probably will solve the problem. Until then.
Any other audience questions? We have a gentleman over here. While we're passing the mic, I got a question for Marty and Keith. So Sid showed in his survey slide the sort of convergence between IT and OT in the organization, right? We're seeing more of a blended approach to cybersecurity and a lot of, increasing overlap or cooperation, hopefully cooperation between IT and OT. And I think the message is, let's learn from each other and let's cooperate. Do you guys have any basic pieces of advice for, our end user clients and the audience today about how they can go back to their plants and kind of make that cooperation happen? I mean, are there best practices or good examples we can look at in the industry where,
Yeah,
this is
there are.
facilitated or?
I'm not sure they're written down anywhere,
Yeah.
but I've seen companies send a person from each of their IT and OT security shops to the same training course. So when we ran the Red Blue at Idaho or through DHS, quite often some of those successes were companies that had that sort of pairing, and quite often it was the first time they'd ever met each other, right? Is when they went to this course. There's others that I've seen that have almost done exchanges where they'll take the IT security person and they'll say, here's your set of Nomex coveralls and boots and hard hat. You're going to work for 6 months in the ICS environment and go around and look at these different well sites, for example, to look at how their perimeter protection is done. And then take the engineer from the operational technology side and say, you're going to sit on the help desk for 6 months so that you get a feel of the types of calls that they handle and the way that they triage and systematically handle those within their call management systems. So, I've seen those, I guess, as my own sort of personal best practices, but maybe that's a task that we should take on as an industry, is to try to document some of those processes.
Yeah, I've always, is this on? Coffee and donuts work well for IT/OT meetings on the floor. Off-site meetings, beer works well. It's like Marty's saying, it's just getting the people together to, discuss, what are really the requirements on each side so that everyone can understand how to properly go about securing these devices.
Yeah, one last one, I guess, too, is operationally, I've seen some pretty good successes with embedding control system people into the enterprise SOC, so into the Security Operations Center, especially big multinational companies. Think about the oil and gas super majors. They have IT or ICS security teams, bigger than this room, right? They can have a meeting of their control system security people. But they're starting to embed that capability or that engineering know-how into their enterprise security operations center, so that when something happens, they can turn to them and go, do you think this could have been a production-related or ICS-related issue, and do we need to do this differently for offshore than upstream? So how do we handle those situations, right?
I think we had a question from the audience, right?
Oh, yeah. Sorry, it's Rob Nolan, Noble Energy, and I regret asking this question now because I think it's going to be too far in the weeds. But Keith, you mentioned something about baselining the components from a security perspective to the point where they start to actually interrupt ICS. Can you talk a little bit about the networking aspect of that?
Yeah, so just to give you a little background on the test bed. So the test bed became fully functional probably about a year or so ago. We spent a significant amount of time baselining the systems so we know what the typical traffic is, what round trip times typically are, what devices talk to what and when. And then once we did that, then before we started doing any of the cybersecurity implementations, we wanted to see what parts of the systems were more sensitive or interesting to do performance measurements on. Obviously, there's some parts of industrial control systems, the higher you go up, the less network performance issues can translate into operational performance issues. So we wanted to see where were the interesting parts of the systems. Then we so we wrote various different software to implement various different network perturbations. So we added in latency to certain issues or certain parts of the network. We withheld packets. We took packets and rewrote them. We did various different network operations to the packets to see, how would it affect the system? Can the system handle it okay? For like latency and those types of issues, what are the thresholds where we start having problems? So that way, when we implement cybersecurity capabilities and technologies, and we measure what the performance impacts are, we kind of have an idea as to where problems should start happening or not. So we did a lot of this testing ahead of time to find out, to characterize the system, to find the interesting parts. Right now, we've been implementing the cybersecurity requirements for about 4 months now. So we're getting into the implementation of the cybersecurity framework in the systems, and we're getting to a point now where we're actually, measuring the impacts of the systems and all that. I'm not sure if that really answers your question. Yeah, it does. Okay.
Good answer, thanks. Well, we have another question up front here. Oh, another one back here first, then we'll get to you, sir. So,
hi, I'm Yosef Helbatimi with Horizon Controls Group. I have a client system owner who recently didn't want to patch his system for the Spectre and Meltdown because he was worried about the performance issues that it would cause. And good call on his part, a week later, realizing it got rescinded. But I kind of told him, I'm like, well, you can only stave that off the inevitable. I mean, the next gen processors are most likely, I would hope, going to have all that built in, theoretically, and the performance hit's going to have to come one way or another. So the more general question is, do you see that there needs to be a correction of the valuation of the automation and OT and IT kind of structure, that we stop thinking that it can deliver X when really we should be having it deliver at a lower level? And I'm not talking about maybe, the speed at which it communicates or something very rudimentary like that, but maybe the speed of innovation or the delivery to market or something of that nature, that we don't just expect things to go at the rate that they're going. They need a correction, essentially.
Well, I'll take a shot at that, I guess. I think that what the Spectre and Meltdown series showed us is that in the operational technology and ICS space, it's absolutely imperative to work lockstep with your vendor to make sure that you understand the ramifications of that kind of patch. I think that in the IT world, we do that fairly well, but I think that we tend to disconnect sometimes the software and hardware environments and go, oh, well, I only have to talk to the Intel and AMD guys over here to talk about a hardware patch. And, I'm sure that Microsoft and the other big boys have figured it out, right? That's not the case in the control system space. And I think you have to think about that as a consolidated unit. I'll tell you that, over the years, and many of you will remember there was, what was it, MS Pug or UG or something, I don't know, the Microsoft Manufacturing User Group, the MUG, MS MUG. We talked for weeks and months and years about, can we get a critical infrastructure specific OS that was, pared down and coupled, and I'm not sure we're going to get there. I'll let Eric take that from there.
Wow, I don't know where to go from that, since we're now all using that pared down version of Windows, right?
Yes.
It was such a success in getting that out of Microsoft. I think that you've nailed a very, very important question and maybe Marty said it really well. How do we understand those interactions? And we don't. We've built ourselves an incredibly complex system. that have all sorts of little moving parts, from hardware to operating system to applications on top of it, and then we interlay that over top of an industrial process that's often very complicated. And I think that's an area that also needs some additional research, and I don't have a good answer on how we deal with it right now. I don't think anybody does. The whole question, it also ties very much into the question of legacy, because we're not using the latest. We have absolutely brand new Windows 10 workstations sitting right beside PLCs that are 25 years old, and the PLCs aren't going anywhere. So we have a problem that is not just how do we deal with the latest good and bad changes, but also how do we make that retroactively work into 25 years of innovation and mistakes.
We have one question up front here, and we have another one a couple of rows behind afterwards. So,
Good morning. My name is Guhan Prabhu. I'm with Aramco Services. I hope this question is not too much in the weeds, but I've been hearing good stuff about application whitelisting and, I guess protecting our assets, for the lack of a better word. So during your course of testing, one of the things that, or rather, let me rephrase that. We are considering implementing an open process automation architecture, and one of the ideas to protect our networks is to use non-routable IP addresses in our way down there. Have you done any testing with non-routable IP addresses, and how does that essentially impact application whitelisting? This might be too much in the weeds. We can talk about this later, but I'm just curious if you guys have played with that permutation, if you will.
We have not yet, at least with our test bed at NIST, something that we potentially are interested in doing, but we have not got to that level of testing yet.
Yeah, and I guess I would disconnect the two. One is a network, feature, and application whitelisting is generally a host, execution protection feature. So we would definitely, I think, the community would recommend, non-routable addresses. You don't want something that's going to easily pass through all of the perimeter protection devices, right? On the application whitelisting, that's another area. You have to work so carefully with your vendor. I've seen implementations of application whitelisting that essentially the solution was to exclude almost every directory that there was any ICS or SCADA product in. So great, you've locked down the OS, but the entire file structure, including all the executables, including all the data configuration, everything is basically an exception. So I think there are control system vendors that have worked very closely with specific application whitelisting vendors to get that nuance or the fidelity correct that's needed to protect. But I think there's other areas where we're in the same place now that we were with firewalls 15 years ago. It's, oh yes, I have a firewall. Allow TCP, any, allow UDP, any. Great, okay? So I have application whitelisting, exclude C:/. So, yeah. Eric, I don't know if you have comments.
Yeah, so back to the application whitelisting thing. So once we start up the application whitelisting specific for control systems project within CCUE in the summer of this year, so hopefully we'll get into more of the nitty-gritty details of that. And then we'll be able to provide, configurations and all that we've come up with, at least in a laboratory setting.
Great answers.
Good morning, Brian Clemens, Dow Chemical. Quick question about the human resources. People need to apply, monitor, and maintain these processes. Has there been any work done in defining qualifications, training, from background checks to talent identification? And just from my perspective, we've got control folks who are taking on more and more analytics, more and more smart instrumentation. Now we're, and security is becoming a larger part of the role. So is there anything going on in that area?
Yes, not enough, I don't think, and that's what. So Automation Federation is a 501c3 nonprofit that was formed essentially to tackle some of these issues like workforce development. So one of the things, several of the things we're doing, we're working with the U.S. Department of Labor. There's a renewed interest in the United States on apprenticeship type programs. So I can see in the future the potential for having an apprenticeship type of approach. There's a document that's called the Automation Competency Model, which outlines what kind of those basic skill sets are, and then as you get into a more specialized type of role, what attributes those have. I'm working with several colleges and universities in the US and Canada to try to synchronize, harmonize, kind of understand their curricula and where we need to go. So yes, I think there's also work going on in organizations such as ISA has training that you can utilize. SANS, Doug Wiley spoke earlier. The industry is talking more and more about personnel certification and what does that mean, and if it's desirable, how many people, do you hire people just because they have a bunch of letters after their name, or do you have some other criteria? So if any of you have any thoughts on that, definitely happy to have you reach out and contact me. Having some corporate, requirements or specifications for that would be fantastic.
Yeah, I agree. Any other questions from the audience? Okay, we have one over here, and while you're passing the mic, I'll ask another question. So a lot of these problems that we're talking about, somebody mentioned the last mile. These seem to be kind of last mile problems, these emerging problems, and we've talked about devices and, with Trisis, Tricon, and Hatman, won't you guess my name, I guess, right? That's a safety system problem. Can you guys give us your impression of what's happening at the device level and sort of this level 0, level 1, issues that we're experiencing right now? Because to me, it's not just devices, it's things like safety systems. I mean, if you had asked us, 10 years ago if we thought a safety system, would be a target for a malware attack, I'm sure most people would have said no. But so what can we do to address this kind of last mile, with devices and subsystems and so forth?
Well, I think you just nailed the crux of the problem. I mean, if you'd asked me 10 years ago, I would have said I'm scared. Back when we were at BCIT, I mean, that's what we did is beat up control systems, including a bunch of safety systems, and
Yeah.
it didn't look particularly pretty back then. We haven't made a lot of progress in that department, but there has been. I mean, Logic did some really, really good studies. For example, the Logic Consortium did some excellent studies on the design and deployment of safety systems and the testing of safety systems. And that would have probably made made that type of attack that we saw on the safety system in the Middle East probably a lot less likely. But I do think you've nailed the problem, and it's everything from how do you take a 20-year-old piece of equipment that has got a very, very weak stack on it and make it robust? How do you successfully patch that system when it's running in a full-time environment? I think those are all problems that we're still needing to deal with. And I think the way we're going to get around it is we probably won't actually end up tearing out all those controllers as much as, say, Dale Peterson or somebody like that would love to suggest, rip and replace. I think it's going to be 20 years of mitigating controls and Band-Aids and solutions on top of our existing systems in order to give them the protection they don't inherently have.
Thanks.
Yeah, this doesn't address the legacy type of issue, and yeah, Dale and his insecure by design, which I absolutely agree with. But I will tell you, you should ask your respective vendors to provide you kind of some insight into their what I'll call advanced forward direction, because I have sat down with the development teams of some of the major mainstream control system vendors, and what they have in their development plans is absolutely it's not insecure by design, right? I mean, they are going to great lengths to embed security into their processes from an authentication and that perspective. So I think that we will see a change and we will see some movement in this, but it's going to take years and decades. And we've been up to, some of us with gray hair here have done this for decades already. So I think the future is bright. I mean, I think that we do have to be cautious, to tie it back to the other gentleman's question. I mean, we do have to be cautious about the pace of adoption of technology in this field so that we don't outrun ourselves. I think we get too hung up by the new and shiny and, hey, my teenagers have this on their phone, why can't I do it in my control system? So there's got to be some sort of throttle that we use along with the brake, right? So that we apply the technology with engineering discipline and due diligence.
I'm going to steal the mic back just for a second because there's another area that also really concerns me. I actually, as Marty said, the major vendors really are working hard to make it secure by design. And so we have all their old gear that isn't secure by design. But the thing that probably scares me more than anything, I think the major vendors are doing a job. What scares me is all the cool little add-on pieces that are getting chucked in there. I was lucky enough after I left Tofino to get an industrial-grade access management system, basically a door control, video camera, punch cards, swipe cards. I managed to get one of those as a bit of a deal, and I put it in my house. It was pretty fun, hey. And this is one of these ones you could take a hammer and beat on. It was really well engineered.
So
Except,
I can open your house with this now.
yeah, you could basically open my house. Actually, you don't have to make that much effort, and that was the scary part. They decided, after they did this wonderful mechanical engineering, to power that access system with power over Ethernet, which meant you had to plug it into your network.
Oh,
And then they decided as an extra feature that you could remotely open and close any gate by just sending it a straight HTTP, not HTTPS, HTTP command to that address with a / open or a / closed at the end of it.
What's that IP address?
Yeah.
Neat, yeah.
I felt bad for the company that did this because they were really great engineers, but they were really great mechanical engineers, and they had wandered off into the world of network connectivity because their customers are saying, we want this networked. And then suddenly, you have that in a real plant, and you have a phenomenal vulnerability going on because you've plugged in something that 5 years ago would never have been on the network. And that actually really scares me. It's not the Rockwells and the Schneiders and the ABBs and the Emersons. It's all the other gear that's getting chucked out there.
Yeah, and this is a good dialogue, right? So it's the IIoT part of the
Yes.
whole
Yeah,
infrastructure.
yeah.
And I have to use another buzzword, right? So we can check the third one off, and that's smart grid, right? When we implemented, advanced metering infrastructures and smart meters were getting rolled out in utilities. I remember in the labs that we could not get one for testing from any of the vendors. We had to go through other acquisition methods to get one because they did not want to slow down the deployment. They had millions and potentially billions of dollars of revenue tied up into deployment of these things, and they didn't want to delay it. We're going to be in exactly the same position with all these edge IoT devices, right? Where companies are going to invent something, they're going to want to get it to market, and they're going to bypass every single security check that they can to get it there. Now, that might be kind of a doom and gloom kind of scenario, but we have to figure out how to manage that tidal wave of devices that's going to literally be at your firewall, overcoming overcoming your perimeter.
Yeah. Geez, I think it was Clint that mentioned it earlier, right? The guy that goes out to Home Depot and buys the cheapo $10, wireless camera to put in his plant, and, what's going to happen as a result of installing these really insecure IoT devices? I don't like to think about it too much.
I know what's going to happen to them. Somebody's going to
Yeah.
come up with internet chemotherapy and build BrickerBot, and
Yeah.
they're going to walk around and they're going to go from device to device to device and basically brick it, and you're going to find out that, holy crap, I got like 10,000 of these sitting in my corporate environment, and they're critical to my business operation. So I have a policy or procedure now that says, if the camera isn't there, you have to shut the plant down because you can't see that vent stack or that door or that,
Right.
that machine. And you've just bricked them all. Now you're going to call your vendor up and you're going to say, I need to have 10,000 of these shipped for tomorrow. And that goes back to, think about Shamoon and when we had, tens of thousands of hard drives that all got made unusable. That was a pretty significant procurement event to replace all of those, right? I don't think that we're prepared in our disaster recovery plans and scenarios to contemplate that kind of mass failure of our infrastructure.
No, certainly not. We had one question over here, and I hate to keep this guy hanging any longer.
Mike Dedzik, ArcelorMittal DeFasco. I'm going to follow up on the Dow question here on the people side here, because I think this is really critical for how we're going to move forward in the process industry, small, medium, and large. So when we look at the skills and competencies needed for the security side here, it's pretty daunting. They're hard to buy, hard to even train because these things keep changing. Thinking of the future here, what do you see as things from a competency perspective that really you got to just have it in place somehow internally versus what do you think might be with a trusted third-party partner, things you could get externally here? What might be the future state of the skills and competencies needed that might be both internal and external there?
So first of all, I think it starts with STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. We got to get our kids interested in technology, not just for technology's sake, but we need to teach them to think about what happens if it doesn't work or how do I break it, get them into that mindset. One of the Automation Federation partners is First Inspires for Inspiration of Science and Technologies. These are the folks that run the Lego, robotics competitions globally. And I'm working with their executive level to go, yeah, the robots is great, but how do we tie some of these, cybersecurity principles and things like that into these competitions? So, I think in this country anyway, we've done ourselves a disservice in that we've basically taught our kids that if you're not a doctor or if you're not a lawyer, you're a failure in society, right? We need to make them aware that, think of something like automotive mechanics. I mean, you have to be able to troubleshoot all the different computer systems and networks inside a car to be a competent, mechanic. There's nothing wrong with being a mechanic with that type of skill set, and I think that we need to empower, our educational systems to be able to absorb that. So that's the starting level, and then I think you're going to see. Post-secondary education, vocational type education. If you go outside of the U.S., look at the polytechnic schools in Germany, for example.
That's right,
I think they really have figured out how to address some of these niche technical areas. So one of my goals and one of the reasons I left the U.S. government was so I could work with international governments to kind of cherry pick who's doing these things well and then to cross-pollinate that across different industries, right? So I think there's some hope. I think we just have to keep our nose to the grindstone, so to speak.
Keith, you want to add anything to that mess? One of the things that I think industry could do that would help a lot, and this comes from being in academia for quite a while, sort of as I took a break and worked at British Columbia Institute of Technology, is make it really clear to the people developing the programs what you want now. One of the sad things about being in academia is it's really easy after you've developed your program to go to sleep and teach the same thing that you taught for the last 20 years, because who wants to rewrite your course materials to keep it up to date? So unless there's a lot of direction from industry saying this is what we want, this is what we're willing to hire, this is what we're willing to make donations for, and drive that, there is a chance that, that academia will teach what was really current 25 years ago and not what we need today. And I'll give you a very specific example, actually. I got a ride with a very nice young woman, an Uber driver, to this conference, and she is studying robotics right now working on getting her diploma in robotics. And I said, oh, I know a fair amount about robotics. What are you guys doing for security? Well, nothing. We don't actually have anything in the program around security. And she is going to graduate with no understanding of security because whoever wrote that program probably wrote it 15 years ago.
Yeah, good point. Well, we're getting near the end. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Yes. We have time for one more.
Okay, this is Gary Lipson from Ashland. Following up on the question prior to that, you were talking about some of the stuff that's going on the periphery, but we're also running into issues where the suppliers of our control systems, we have a lot of tools that are now available to us to help us figure out security and test them, and they're reluctant to let us run them on there, or at least certify that they'll allow us to run it. Can you comment some on, you know, we understand that they want to keep sort of the integrity of their systems, but there's also this need for common tools and platforms. Can you talk about some of that and what you see in the industry?
So I guess I would point you towards, there was some conversation about the open development processes, Don Bertuziak's brainchild that's going on. So, you know, there's definitely two camps. There's the very, very open, everything should be open, and then there's the, no, we should keep it all proprietary. And they're very closely related, right? If you go back into the question that was, how do you protect against the, you know, meltdown inspector and you know, go back to that legacy design where everything was proprietary and the vendor was basically then liable or you know, held responsible for the operation of absolutely everything in that system. You know, that's one end of the spectrum. The other end is everything is open and nobody's responsible. We're all responsible, right? The global open community is responsible. You know, I think that you vote with your pocketbook, right? I mean, I've seen really good application of things like my former team at ICS CERT's procurement language project that was a partnership with SANS and others, where you absolutely have the power to specify in your contract documents what your expectations of the vendor community are, as far as products, as far as services, as far as security. You can specify, you know, you can at least ask them, you need to explain to us as part of this bid process, how do you respond to a security incident if a researcher posts a 0-day flaw in the firmware on your controller? What is your company's response to that? And we're going to grade that or metric that as part of the process. Now, they may choose not to respond to your proposal, and then you're going to get a shorter and shorter list of vendors, right? But especially big corporations, and or, you know, big institutions like the U.S. government. I mean, DoD has done some of those things in procuring, you know, operating systems and that, you know. So it is possible. I think that you need to look at what you really, really need and start with a very short list and then grow it from there. And you know what? I worked for a vendor. I also worked as an end user, and as an end user asset owner, there were times when I told the vendor, I said, I don't care what you tell me. I'm going to do it anyway. And they said, you know what? That's your prerogative, but then you're accepting the risk. And I remember the example was in the early days of virtualization. I said, I'm going to run all this stuff in a VM. And they said, well, we're not going to warranty, or if there's anything that breaks, you know, we won't fix it. I said, I don't care. I'm just going to move it back to iron. If there's something that's broken, you can fix it out there in the old world, and then I'll take your fix and port it back into the VM. And guess what? 10, 15, 20 years later now, you know, similar vendors now will go, oh, okay, we've pre-certified, and here's your, you know, here's the process. So I think you need to ask them the hard questions, and then I think you need to take the answers that you don't like from those hard questions and codify them in your procurement documents.
All right. Do we have any other last questions? I think it's been a great discussion. I think we're at the end right now. So I think we're back in here for the cyber insurance session, right? Are we back in this room, Alan?
Aren't you the
at lunchtime. Yeah, I don't have the deck in front of me, so yeah, we're here. There's boxed lunches out there, but let's have a hand for our panelists slash presenters. And thanks everybody for your questions, and we'll continue the discussion over lunch.
Yeah.